right, let's talk about the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders have recently pulled off a couple really nice additions, and there's one in particular we really like. The Raiders, of course, have had a monumental offseason, a lot of great moves, a lot of big time changes. And now, post draft, the Raiders are making some other really smart moves. And there's one in particular we think has a chance to have a big impact for the Raiders, and that is the addition of wide receiver Jaylen Guyton. Let's get into the article, and then we'll talk about it more in detail on the other side. This is courtesy of Raiders Wire. Raiders GM Tom Telesco has brought a familiar face on board in Las Vegas. Jaylen Guyton, who played with the Chargers the past 5 seasons, has been signed on in Las Vegas. After not taking a wide receiver in last month's draft, the Raiders have now signed 2 free agent wide receivers in the past week. Last week, they added former Cowboys wide receiver Michael Gallup. Adding some wide receiver help was crucial as they were woefully thin at the position. They had starters Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers, along with second-year man Trey Tucker, and not a whole lot else, giving both Guyton and Gallup a decent chance of cracking the roster. On top of this, the Raiders also announced the addition of former Saints veteran offensive lineman Andrews Pete. Pete was maybe a bigger name, but we think Jaylen Guyton has a chance to have a really big impact for the Raiders offense going forward. And Miles, I know you've got some thoughts on this, but first, Raiders fans in the comment section below. Obviously, GM Tom Telesco, based on his time with the Chargers, came to Las Vegas with some baggage, came to Las Vegas with some concerns, but he's doing a pretty good job so far. But we want to hear from you. How would you grade Telesco's performance up to this point? Do you think he's done well? Give him an A. Do you think maybe he could do a little bit better? Maybe it's a C. Whatever it is, grade GM Tom Telesco's performance in the comment section below. But Miles, give me your thoughts on the addition of Jaylen Guyton and what he could mean for this Raiders offense.
Yeah, Nick, I think Guyton is a very interesting prospect, especially like you mentioned. Telesco is from the Chargers, so I think this is a guy in Guyton who comes over to this roster and maybe kind of got overlooked in Los Angeles. This is a guy who came in, obviously, he had some talent. He made the roster year after year for the Chargers, but the roster of the Chargers was very wide receiver heavy at the time. You had stars, guys like Keenan Allen, guys like Mike Williams, who are always going to be at the top of that roster. If you're ever going to get any playing time, you're kind of battling for that third spot. They had guys coming in and out like Josh Palmer, who was successful at times. They had guys coming in and out like Quentin Johnson last year or so, who probably would dominate a role over a guy like Guyton being a first round pick. So I just think Guyton maybe really didn't get his chance to shine in 2021 and 2020 were the years where he was the biggest. And I think he did pretty good in those years, in limited catches. He got over like around 500 yards both years, 3 touchdowns both years. He was good for a couple of big plays. This is a guy who had 72-yard catch and run, 59-yard catch and run. He really looks like there was a lot of potential under there. As a guy that was passed over on this roster just because there was so much talent in the Chargers receiving room. I think Telesco sees that. Being from the Chargers, he has to know a lot about a guy like Guyton, and to bring him over to the Raiders, to put his reputation on the line, saying, hey, this is your guy. You're bringing him over here. I think that says a lot. So I think it's a really interesting move by the Chargers. But I think this is Tom Telesco saying, hey, there's something with this Guyton guy that I think adds to our roster. And I think he was being severely overlooked in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect example of a low risk, high reward move. And I agree with you 100%. Guyton's a big play machine waiting to happen, especially during that 2 year run with the Chargers. And if we look at the Los Angeles Chargers over the past half decade or so, the issue with Los Angeles has not been the talent on the team. Everyone knows the coaching was the problem with the Chargers. And so I think Telesco recognizes that Jaylen Guyton was probably misused in LA, and he thinks Telesco thinks that under Antonio Pierce and this Raiders staff, Guyton will have a skill set to be put in a really strong position. And Guyton's one of those interesting big play threats, because when you look at big play receivers, they generally fall into one of two buckets. They're either throw the ball 50 yards downfield and they get separation, win a 50-50 ball, or you throw a 5 yard pass to them and they have the game-breaking speed, yards after catch to run for 50, right? That's usually what happens. Two very stylistically different ways to generate big plays. Guyton, when he was having success with the Chargers, was very rare. In fact, he was probably the only guy in the NFL to be really good at both. In 2020, he was the only player to be top 10 in average depth of target and average yards after catch per reception. I'm going to say that again. He was the only player in the NFL, Jaylen Guyton, in 2020 who was top 10 in both average depth of target and average yards after a catch per reception. That means this is a guy who can generate big plays with his vertical down the field, throwing it 50 yards down the field, and he can generate big plays with yards after a catch. That is incredibly rare. And that means this is a guy, if he taps into that at all, this is a guy that will be a huge weapon for this Raiders offense, because they obviously have their number one receiver in Devontae Adams. They have their third down kind of chain mover guy in Jacoby Myers. They've got their X factor playmaker and Brock Bowers they just added into the fold. They just need now a big play threat. We saw that earlier with Michael Gallup. Gallup's a guy who had a great years, couple really good years with Dallas, but the injuries have really ended his career. He's not the same player. Jaylen Guyton, not quite the same. His was more of a misuse with the Los Angeles Chargers. I think he's a guy that can come into the fold here, and he doesn't need a lot of targets. He can get 20, 30 receptions and generate a lot of big plays for this Raiders offense. This has a chance to be one of those sneaky good moves that people don't really notice during the offseason that has a big impact come the regular season. And I think General Manager Tom Telesco, I asked Raider Nation for you guys to grade his performance. I think so far as we look at moves like this, you're going to have to grade him pretty highly because this is a really smart strategy and great roster design by Telesco here.
Yeah, Nick. And one more interesting fact kind of about both the receivers. They have crossed paths before. Guyton was actually a guy who was signed by Dallas in 2019 as an undrafted free agent. They did spend time together on the roster because Gallup was obviously there at the same time as well. But, Dallas unfortunately passed on Guyton that very same year. So although it was for a short time, these two have crossed paths together before. So I think, Guyton and Gallup both being from Dallas is also very interesting in the mix as well. Might not add a whole lot to the situation, but an interesting tidbit nonetheless. And like you said, I think this is going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds and if he's able to make it strong.